son. The day you were born, the very forests of Lordaeron whispered the name Arthas.
Fantasy stories are often known by its villains. It is where our heroes or group of heroes struggle on and develop as characters. It adds a sense of urgency, of danger. They are usually found at the forefront of the story to taunt us, to intimidate us, to one day face them. They are the main reason we do what we do, on wanting to get powerful and achieve that next level in order to defeat them. We usually know that our heroes are gonna win, but the journey towards that win always makes it exciting, thrilling, and fun. Lord of the Rings had Sauron, Dragon Age had the Archdemon, The Witcher had the Wild Hunt, Dark Souls had Gwen, Game of Thrones had the Night King, but well, we all know how that turned out. And Warcraft, more specifically World of Warcraft, has had many. Some better than others, but earlier expansions were often focused around these said villains, the big bad, such as the Lich King, Illidan, and Deathwing. Villains that were featured from day one to tease you, to taunt you that one day, in this expansion, you will find him. He's waiting for you, and boy, isn't he a badass. Giving you chills down your spine, your hands trembling with excitement that one day, after your journey through the expansion, after all that build-up from the initial cinematic to the last raid, where you will finally be able to throw down with the most badass and strongest character ever placed in the game at the time. So what happened? Well, Deathwing happened. You see, WoW expansions from TBC to Cataclysm always had the same premise. Here's new content, new level cap, new zone, and etc. And here's your new badass villain or threat for you to fight. Illidan and demons, Lich King and the undead, Deathwing and the Old God forces / Twilight. Let's call them the triad of villains in expansions in WoW. But suddenly, with Mists of Pandaria and all expansions that followed, the face of the expansion, the big bad, the big dick villain, mysteriously disappeared. Now, in fairness, we were in need of a change. The first 3 expansions felt all too similar in the overall arcing story. So, Mists of Pandaria decided not to introduce the big bad guy as the main focal point of the set story, at least not as clearly, that is, as the villain and last boss, Garrosh, was slowly built in the background ever since Cataclysm, really. But the main plot here was the faction war and this newfound continent and, well, the pandas, in order to feel different and new. Okay, that's fair enough. But that was 7 years ago, and as I said, all subsequent expansions have left out the big bad guy. Warlords of Draenor, it tried with the Orc leaders, but as we all know too well, all went to crap and eventually we got Archimonde pulled out of Blizzard's ass. Legion? Well, sure, you might say Legion had a big bad, as in the Demonic Legion, the Burning Crusade, but there was no face to add to it all. The face of Legion, as in the expansion itself, was Illidan, and he was a friendly this time around. The Legion, when it came to being a villain, was just demons. And sure, we had Gul'dan and Kil'jaeden, but those were limited and condensed to patch cycles. In an expansion called Legion, with such self-proclaimed world threat, there was no big villain to put a face to it. Sargeras? He shows up once in a badass cinematic, sure, but not seen in-game once, taking aside whispers and chit-chat. Argus? Well, like previously with Archimonde in WoD, was pulled out of nowhere, as there was no previous established lore for that character. No build-up outside of its respective patch cycle. As for Battle for Azeroth, it's all over the place. Faction war, Old God threats, Ajara, Naga, Sylvanas. Once again, we were met with no clear threat to ultimately be the face of the expansion. Villains have turned into villains of the patch, much like an expansion now feels like you're just playing the patch, not the expansion. And that has become ever more evident over time. What about vanilla then? Classic WoW, although much beloved and amazing in many ways, you can argue that it also didn't have a main villain throughout that journey, that experience. Starting with Molten Core, an elemental-based raid, to dragon-based raids with Blackwing Lair, to Bugs and Cthulhu in Silitus, to Undead with Nextramas. Out of all of WoW, a classic raiding is probably the most varied when it comes to themes, but also all over the place when it comes to the story and lore. But Classic was a different game entirely. It was a game about us and our adventure in this crazy new world. Having no clear villain didn't matter as much, as the game felt more sandboxy and was the introduction to the MMO as a whole, so having no clear threat in the game can be easily justifiable, and it does make sense. Expansions, however, have often a central theme, a central point, be demons, undead, old gods, or visiting some new land. Now, having no clear villain can be good. Mists of Pandaria did many great things story-wise. It allowed the story to flow and branch to many different areas. It allowed characters to grow, it allowed new characters to flourish that didn't have development or didn't exist in games like Warcraft 3. It can also add a sense of mystery to the overall expansion. A more recent example with Legion, many wondered, including myself, as to what and where the last raid and boss would be. Who are we gonna fight? Sargeras? Kil'jaeden? Some other badass demon? This can lead to discussions and engagement from part of the community. Hell, it's fun to theorize. Just look at Pyromancer. And knowing of what's gonna come next can be exciting, and like I said, it allows the story to go to many different places, like is the case now in BFI. But damn, wasn't it cool to know and see that's where the last raid is gonna take place, as you stared at the frozen and metal peaks of Icecrown Citadel during Wrath of the Lich King, or the demon-infested Black Temple in TBC. Having that last raid taunt you from the start of the game, from the start of the expansion, added a sense of awe, motivation almost, to get to that raid and boss. And it's been 4 expansions, 7 to 8 years since we had that feeling. TBC didn't do a great job of this, granted. In fact, you didn't felt the presence of Illidan too much outside of Shadowmoon Valley and the awesome intro cinematic, which was unfortunate, but in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard sought to improve that. The presence of the Lich King was now found in almost every single new zone, and even in some dungeons. Now, from the moment you stepped into Northrend, you were in his territory. Sure, quests and all of that were scripted, but doing it for the first time, some random-ass quests, and have Lich King pop up and toying with you was awesome. Everything from quests to dungeons eventually led to the Lich King himself. There was a clear thread from the beginning of the expansion to the last patch. We had our side tours with Ulduar and the like, but the Lich King never ceased to be the main focal point, the main threat that you felt at every step of the way. Cataclysm followed the exact same formula, which led to the change in Mists of Pandaria to happen, but who doesn't remember getting burned by Deathwing randomly in the world? That was so cool, though annoying, but it made you feel like he was this badass and powerful villain. And this is without mentioning the fact that he was a huge-ass dragon, the size of a freaking zone. From day one I thought to myself, how are we gonna fight this thing, right? Because, like the Lich King, we saw him around, but unlike the Lich King, he was quite big. Well, it sure didn't turn out like anything I imagined. Deathwing, unlike Illidan and Lich King, also had another issue outside of the fight itself. To make a great villain, you also need a good story. Lich King, Arthas, and even Illidan had an amazing, beautiful, and tragic storyline found all the way back in Warcraft 3. Deathwing felt more like he was just an evil dragon for people not really known with the lore. The story and the villain will always be inherently connected. In order for the player to care about that villain, and in turn, care about the expansion. And any fantasy story needs a good villain, a big bad. Especially a fantasy story based on an RPG that also happens to be an MMO, particularly focusing on gearing and getting your character ever more powerful. Having a cool and intimidating villain alone is enough to make people play a game. How many people do you think started playing Wrath of the Lich King solely because of how badass the cinematic and a villain he was? Likewise, having a villain that you can see in-game taunting you can be turned into an incentive to keep playing the expansion, on knowing that everything that you are working on right now will make you, in time, reach that said raid and face the enemy you wanted to smash your weapon in almost 2 years ago, as you trembled with excitement watching that first cinematic play out. Now granted, catch-up mechanics and the overall way the game and gameplay now functions with patches and cycles have removed some of this journey, but having a face that you can point at, having this force messing with you from day one can be a powerful incentive on itself, and boy, isn't it badass and cool. And let's be real, there's not many great villains left in WoW right now. All the great Warcraft characters like the Lich King or Illidan have long but evaporated. Even Azshara is now basically gone as a big villain, arguably wasted on a content patch, though likely to be back in the future. But we have been building some over the past years in WoW itself, some even quite complex. And one of those is the current biggest and immediate threat of WoW that has recently resurfaced more clearly. Literally, N'Zoth.
I am a god! Before you walked this land, I ruled.
I want to see some tentacle action. That's simple. I want the game to go full-on hentai with N'Zoth and old gods in the next expansion, because it needs it. It needs that clear villain once more, and I'm biased because I've been craving it since Mob. I want to see a badass cinematic, full-on tentacles. Sure, seeing a battle or a group of people like Legion and Battle for Azeroth and Warlords of Draenor is cool and dandy, but having the villain in full display in that Blizzard CGI glory, there's nothing like it. I want to see some old Guardian, eerie and creepy voice in the background, chilling every bone and hair on my body. I want to feel afraid and excited all at the same time, and that one day, me and my friends and my guild, or watching Method going for world first, eventually walking upon the spire or tower or dungeon or the depths of some crazy Lovecraftian location of wherever it may lay rest its gargantuan body. I want to be threatened by it, the day I step upon its land to the day I damage its nasty and naughty tentacles after acquiring all the power and gear that I need. That's the power a good villain can do in an RPG. N'Zoth is the best answer to this current lack of a true villain in WoW, to add this badass feel back into the game, to add balls back into Warcraft. We had enough build-up. We had enough beating around the bush, okay? We need a true villain back. We need them tentacles. N'Zoth has been built for over 8 years, ever since Cataclysm, which surprisingly makes him the most complete villain since probably, I dare say, the Lich King. Granted, not as complex or relatable. N'Zoth, specifically subplot, has been nothing but amazing the past years in Legion and now here in BFI. All the little hints and clues to be found by those more avid to the lore. All these tricks, deceits, and manipulations have been nothing but fascinating to watch, and hopefully all of that will pay off in the next expansion, and more importantly, not end up going from this full hard-on hype to a wet noodle by having a fight akin to Deathwing. Gameplay also matters greatly, as much as a story, don't forget, as both the Lich King and the Illidan were not only badass characters and villains, but their fights, man oh man, were they awesome, perfectly fitting their character and the threat that they posed. So please, make the fight awesome. So what about you? Do you want to be wrapped around by the tentacles of madness? Do you want the second coming of the undead, or a more direct action from the void? Do you want dragons to be at the forefront again? Do you want titans or the light to be the next big bad guys? Do you want to have a face to it all, or have it be more general and more collective like the Legion? Or are you content with the faction war and all these random stories on a patch by patch cycle? And the theme of it doesn't really matter to you in the slightest as long as you get that juicy loot. The great Warcraft villains might be gone, but there's many great ones still around, built during this hiatus of great villains in WoW, slowly coming to life in the background, and I think it is time that the next expansion starts bringing them forth, and once again, at a face that we can point at and say, one day, I'll fight it, I'll kill it, and I'll loot it. So do let me know in the comments while I patiently await for November for the release of the much-awaited N'Zoth cinematic at BlizzCon. One can hope. Okay guys, remember to subscribe and like if you want to see more videos like this, and I will see you all again very soon.